Well, after our last little endeavour with a little gremlin-like creature, which we were able to successfully cage up, at least for the time being, it's somewhere where it can't do any harm at the moment. We continued on to our first possible destination. Or at least we would have, but we needed to make an emergency pit stop, as that little gremlin bugger did more damage than I initially thought. Well, I say I have no idea how much damage or how critical it actually was. I was just told that. I'm no expert on rocket travelling, I don't claim to be. So if the crew, the people who are actually, piloting this say that there's an issue, then yeah, I'm gonna be inclined to believe them and go along with that, considering that, they kind of had my life in their hands. Anywho, we made a stop on the nearest planet. Basically, so they could make some final and more vital repairs that they were unable to do while we were in motion. If anything, it gave myself and Tom a chance to stretch our legs a bit. I was finally able to get a bit of rest and take some of my medication. Still not feeling particularly great, though, well, until I find a cure, I guess I'll never be. But at least I wasn't in agonising pain anymore. The planet we landed on was pretty rocky. It did have a bit of vegetation growing here and there. When we arrived, it was night. In the sky, we saw a big, bright, full moon, with daybreak just starting to break through. The sunrise was something that I hadn't seen in a very long time. It's just when you get so busy and, frustrated things, you kind of forget those little things, those nice little moments, and something so simplistic that literally happens on a daily basis. The sun rising in the morning. I stood there side by Tom as we waited for the sun to fully rise. We then saw on the rocks below us a small rabbit-like creature, which was slightly larger than a rabbit, roughly around twice the size. It seemed harmless and just seemed to be, frolicking about a bit. However, this wouldn't last, as we heard a growling sound coming behind some rocks nearby. Then, from behind the rocks, a wolf-like creature leaped out. It was huge with its pulsating eyes. It grabbed the rabbit-like creature in its jaws, instantly snapping its neck in one bite. The bite was so powerful, however, that blood spurted out everywhere as the sun finally began to rise. Myself and Tom were obviously in shock and horror. However, this would turn out to be one of the least shocking things compared to what was about to happen. The huge wolf-like creature was no ordinary wolf. It began to morph as the sun rised into the sky, covering the moon. The creature's fur began to disappear. Its whole body and bone structure began to rearrange itself and morph into something much more familiar, into a human being. This was not just a wolf-like creature. Oh, no. This was a werewolf. After the shock and surprise that myself and Tom were experiencing, our wolf, now turned human, finally spotted us. He still had parts of the rabbit-like creature in his mouth. He then also realised that he was completely bollock naked. However, he had come prepared for this. Something that I hadn't noticed before on his werewolf form was the fact that a satchel was round his neck. and in the satchel was some clothes. He then proceeded to get dressed in front of us, trying to awkwardly try and avoid eye contact, but occasionally having the quick glance both ways just to see if the other was looking. When he finally put some trousers and a shirt on, he finally spoke to us, saying that he was sorry for startling us, and beckoned us to come down with a hand gesture. I, of course, immediately proceeded, whereas Tom was a bit more hesitant, which probably was the more logical decision, but it never will be the one that I would make. He introduced himself as Robert, or Bob for short. I then, of course, me being me, introduced myself and introduced Tom. Bob shook my hand first. However, Bob then realised it still had blood on it. He apologised again, saying how deeply sorry he was and everything, though kind of stopped to mid-sentence, as I proceeded to lick it off. I don't know, I just couldn't help myself. The taste of blood is just so fruity and delicious for me. Like, any opportunity I get to try some is just, well, irresistible. I think Bob was a bit confused. I think he must have thought that I was being turned on or something. But regardless, Bob then proceeded to wipe the blood off his hand and offer his hand out to Tom. However, Tom just stood there and just nodded as politely as he could. Bob then placed both of his hands in his pocket and looked down at the ground, at the remains of the rabbit-like creature. He then finally addressed the elephant in the room, or the outside, or whatever you want to call these. The first thing he said was, "Yes, I am a werewolf." He seemed to acknowledge that obviously this was an odd and weird thing. This led to the conclusion that he was either a lone werewolf or there wasn't many of them. Bob then continued to say that we probably thought that he was disgusting, inhuman, and just an overall weirdo and outcast. I leaned forward so that I would make it into his gaze, so that he would be able to finally look me in the eye. I could tell that this was awkward for him, and I needed to ease the tension, so I decided to stake some common ground. I said, "You're a werewolf. So what? Have you seen what I look like? At least you can change back into human form. I look like this 24/7. And my friend here is a cyborg. You're disgusted with yourself for killing this animal. By the looks of it, was on sheer instinct. And look, I shook hands with you. I got blood from that animal on my hand. Most normal people would go, ooh, or just wipe it off me. I licked it. Because I can't help it, because I enjoy the taste. My dear fellow, there are very few things that can be totally shocking, disturbing, or abnormal or weird to us. After the amount of things we've seen, this is just an average day." Bob then proceeded to ask me if I was a public speaker of some sorts. I said that I had done a bit of public speaking, though it was not my profession, as my true profession, or at least the one that I was passionate about, was the music industry. Bob then placed his hand on his face, in a way to suggest that he was thinking or trying to picture what I was saying. However, he quickly realised that he still had blood all over his face. He grabbed a handkerchief from his satchel and proceeded to wipe the blood off. He was about to put it away, though he noticed that I'd gotten a whiff of it. He could see that my eyes had widened. I was just so desperate for it. He then offered it out to me. I almost snatched it away from him. Now I was the one feeling disgusted with myself. I think the only thing Tom was feeling was embarrassment now, as I sucked all of the juices out of the handkerchief. I did, though, quickly apologise for my behaviour. I then decided to ask a question that I'd been wondering about. So, sorry about this, and yeah, I'm sorry if this offends, but have you always been a werewolf? Or is it something that's happened to you? I normally won't ask, but I'm just trying to find out if it's connected to a couple of other odd occurrences that myself and Tom have been having recently. Bob paused for a moment and said an answer that I wasn't really expecting, that wasn't particularly the most useful thing, or was it? He said he remembered being fully human, but he suspected that those memories were false, just something generic that was implanted into his mind. I asked him what gave him that idea. He said simply that it was a lack of detail. There was no emotion to the memories. Whenever he tried to remember a day from his past before becoming a werewolf, it would just feel like a bunch of facts in his head, like geographical locations. He was unable to feel things, any attachment or emotional connection, unlike the memories he had when he was a werewolf. He then also said that the memories he did have of this time were very few and only had basic information, almost as if it was backstory to a character. He then asked about me, if I was like him. Did I have memories of being human but felt no emotion to them? I told him unfortunately that wasn't the case, and unlike himself I had witnesses as well. But more than that, I had memories that had emotion to them. I remembered good days and bad days, a lot of them depressing, before I became the way I did. Also, unlike Robert, I actually remembered how I became the way I did. However, despite all the differences, I did feel a connection to him. However, unlike myself, where I am perfectly comfortable looking and being the way that I am, a half human and half scarver, Robert was clearly not comfortable being a werewolf, and I did wonder to myself if anything could actually be done about that. After all, if the memories truly were false, then maybe he was always a werewolf and this is just his natural state. I had no way of knowing, and I had no idea what to do now. I finally decided to change the subject by going, So, Robert, so do you just live out here, or do you have a house or some sort of place to live in? He told us he had a small wooden cottage, which was hidden from the town, that was apparently fairly nearby. This was so that when he transformed, no one from the town would see it, as apparently the townspeople hated the werewolf. But unfortunately, Robert still needed to live near the town in order to get supplies. From what he described, this town was pretty primitive, and by the sounds of it, didn't have any electricity. The supplies I mentioned were just simple things like firewood, as well as food for himself when he wasn't in his wolf form. Unfortunately, before we were able to continue the conversation, a bow was fired, just narrowly missing the three of us. Robert immediately took off, believing that one of the village folk had seen him transform back into human, and were now out to kill him. Tom attempted to go after him, while I crouched down to the ground. However, it was when the second shot was fired that made Robert and Tom stop in their tracks. The villager with the bow and arrow wasn't aiming at Robert. He was aiming at me. I heard him calling out, saying, "You'll die for this, werewolf, and death will be your only mercy." It was obvious that they thought that I was the werewolf. I mean, for one, obviously my fur is a different colour. Mine being a very luxurious blonde, whereas Robert's was all black, with maybe a hint of grey in there. Still, though, I guess under the cover of darkness. Wait, why am I making excuses? They're bloody mad. That's what they are. Robert hid himself behind some rocks, and Tom ducked down behind some trees, keeping out of sight. There was now a second arrow-wielding maniac firing as well, though. With no other options, and with them closing in on me, I had no choice. I sat up and got onto my knees and raised my hands in the air, shouting, "I surrender!" Although these people were primitive, they did recognise a surrender. The two men from the village then violently throttled me to the ground. I wasn't even resisting. I think they just wanted to throttle me. They then tied my arms behind my back, as well as tying my hands together, and my legs. They then grabbed a nearby large tree branch, and tied me to that as well. The two of them carried me back to the village. As they were carrying me, I was just able to make out Tom and Robert peeping out, watching them take me away. If they were prepared to kill me with a bow and arrow, I wondered what fate they had in store for me now. And I couldn't exactly be able to convince them that I wasn't a werewolf. I mean, I could try my best, my appearance is more cat-like than wolf-like. But somehow I feel that that wouldn't matter to them. I imagine even if Robert had transformed into his werewolf form right in front of them, that they would have shot at me. They would have shot at him as well, but they would have fired arrows at me as well. Unfortunately, in my current predicament at that time, there wasn't a lot I could do other than rely on Robert and Tom. As I was dragged into the town centre, the people around me threw rotten fruit or whatever they could get their hands on, and pelted me with it relentlessly. All I could do is say, "Oh, come on, do I look like a werewolf to you? And before you actually think about this, do I actually look anything like a werewolf?" Oh! Was that a frozen potato? That's rock solid, Oh wait, was that the point? A knife then was raised to my neck, and I was told to remain silent. I then asked them, "Why? What are you gonna do to me? You seemed pretty happy to try and kill me a few moments ago. What's changed now?" I was then told that I was to be sacrificed. That evening at the full moon, my body was to be cut open while I was still alive. If my guts and blood pouring all over would restore everything somehow. My obvious reaction was, "I've never heard something so fucking idiotic in my life. If you're gonna kill me, just get on with it. Heck, even if you locked me up, I'd be dying soon anyway. So go on, kill me now. Kill me!" A neckerchief was then tied around me to stop me talking. The tree branch was then attached to a couple of poles using some rope. The two men that had been carrying me finally stood back and allowed the townspeople to continue pelting me. I then felt a dizzy spell come over me. The Omicron virus. Obviously, the way I was dangling from a tree branch wasn't exactly helping the situation, surprisingly enough. I then fell unconscious for what must have been several hours, as when I woke it was clearly the afternoon. The sun's position had changed, and now it was starting to seem a lot more orangey. As my vision slowly began to return and the blurs of my surroundings began to come sharp again, I could make out a large bladed knife, presumably used by a butcher, judging by the looks of it. Though in this case, I was the one who was going to be butchered. Some people may say at this point this is where they turned vegetarian or vegan, or, well, surprisingly, no. Not in my case. In fact, I've just ate a doner kebab. Though, obviously, those aren't exactly the best parts of the meat. But, anyhow. I then noticed that I was also being guarded. The townsfolk had presumably lost interest in me until the big event where I would be cooked up. How delicious. I also spotted a couple of men sitting on a bench. Both of them were covered up and as cloaked as possible. It took me a second, but then I recognised who they were. It was Tom and Bob. Though they seemed to be ignoring me, their gaze was more on the guards guarding me. Either that, or they didn't want to give eye contact to give the game away. Either way, this was a good sign for me, giving me at least a bit of hope. My hands and feet were beginning to feel numb, as the blood circulation was slowly being cut off. However, if I was cut open, this would hardly matter. Still, though, I was in pain and agony, being held up by my wrists and ankles by my own weight. Obviously, for a short period of time, this isn't a problem, but for hours, this was hardly an ideal situation. I reckoned even if I was cut free, I probably wouldn't even have the strength to crawl away. The pain and agony was so much, I felt like I was about to pass out again. My head dropped down as I lost the strength to keep it up. One of the two guards that were watching me came over to check, presumably just in case I died. Bob and Tom saw their chance, and by grabbing a nearby spade, they hit the guard who wasn't tending to me over the head, and did the same to the other before he had time to react. They were both knocked out unconscious. However, the loud sound that it made gained tension. It was clear that they didn't have time to cut me free. Tom lifted the branch up, and then threw me over his shoulder. He then made a break for it, leaving Robert on his own. The townsfolk surrounded him. I remember I heard them shouting, "Traitor! Traitor!" over and over again. Tom was able to easily outrun our pursuers. He hid himself and me behind some rocks, and waited for them to go away. Since I was now upright, my strength had returned, and so had my mouth apparently, as the first thing I said was, "Right, now get me out of here!" Tom gave a sarcastic smile and said, "Grateful, are we?" As he wasn't timing, I said, "Never mind that now. Don't get too comfortable either. We're going back down to the village for Robert." Tom looked a bit shocked at me, and asked me why would I consider doing something so stupid. After all, we'd just escaped from there. He agreed that, obviously, we should rescue Robert, but wouldn't it be better to bring our crew? After all, they had weapons that were far beyond these simple townfolk. I said, well, that may be, they did greatly outnumber us. No, this had to be a quick and stealthy operation. A quick in and out. Tom then said he wondered if me being unconscious and being left to hang for so long had affected my brain cells. I told him no, but I would be affecting his if he didn't come along. Grateful though I was for Tom for rescuing me, I didn't have time for this now. Night would be falling soon, and if they saw Robert turn into a werewolf, well, I can imagine he would have the same fate that I would have had if they had not have rescued me. So obviously I vowed to return that favour. I just hoped that I would be able to. Night was now falling. Myself and Tom knew that it would only be a matter of time before that full moon would come out, which would mean Robert's inner werewolf would come out quite literally. They had tied up Robert's hands and feet, much as they had done to me. However, unlike me, they had allowed him to sit down. They had placed him in the exact same place where they placed me, only without having the inconvenience of blood rushing to their head. I noticed where they were keeping Robert nearby was a load of stacks of hay, and lying next to that was a crate of wine. This then gave me an idea. I quickly told Tom what I was planning, and he admitted while it was dangerous, it was our best bet of rescuing Robert. We got as close as we possibly could without being seen. I then reached down to my ankle and grabbed my gun. I made sure that the setting was not set to maximum power to kill. What we wanted was a distraction, plus that would also use up more power. And to be honest, I was sick of constantly having to recharge after every time. I then fired at the crate of wine. The heat and intensity of the blast was enough to ignite the alcohol within it, which then quickly spread to the haystack. This caused the diversion that we wanted. However, it seemed that these people could not be fooled by the same sort of trick twice, as there were a group of 3 people behind us with pitchforks and torches. I felt it was time for me to do a speech. If anything, it was just a play for time. And hey, it did work. So I started off with, "Right! Okay, everybody, just calm down. There's no need to be pointing anything at me or my friends here. I know you're all a bit eager, but, well, what can I say? I'm not the werewolf, I haven't done anything. And neither have my friends. Though do not question it yourselves, does it not seem really odd, familiar, and thematic? Does it not? No? My distraction was not working particularly well, and me biding time wasn't either. It was clearly running out, and Robert was beginning to transform. As the moon fully shone out, Robert had fully transformed into a werewolf. "Well, there you are. There's your werewolf." I could see the shock on their faces. "What's this, say? Not so blood-hungry now, are we?" Surprising, I know. I was a bit shocked myself when I saw it. But look, he's not a rabid beast or anything like that. He's still the same Robert that you knew. He just looks a bit different, that's all. I used to look like you. I used to look the same as everybody else. Believe me, it was insufferable and boring. Now, I'm not saying a look defines you. Oh, no. What I'm saying is a look, just how the way you look just doesn't change who you are. This is still Robert. Go, Robert, say something to them. Please. In Robert's eyes, I could see a reflection of the moon. Unlike other werewolves in fiction, Robert still maintained his mental capacities and was able to speak. The first thing he did was obviously admit that he was the werewolf, and he apologised for everything that he had done in his werewolf form. He talked about the urges and that he felt whilst in this form. And when he'd finally finished, the leader of this mob group, whom I'd recognised was the person who had taken me captive initially, decided that they weren't going to sacrifice him or kill him. Instead, banishment. And the same went for myself and Tom. Obviously, myself and Tom were more than happy to get away from them. But even in his werewolf form, I could tell that Robert was saddened by the thought. I put my arm round his shoulder. At least I think it was his shoulder. And when I say round, I mean more on. I mean, he was, now in his transformed state, considerably taller than me. But anyway, I said to him, "Don't worry, you can come with us. If anything, I want to get to the bottom of what these strange, monstrous occurrences that have been happening recently are." The 3 of us then walked back to the rocket. Robert had never seen anything like it before, and our crew had never seen anything, well, quite like an actual werewolf before. Mind you, to see that they took it better than the villagers did was, well, the understatement of the century. There wasn't a spare cabin for him, though I offered him to share mine. And now, with all repairs complete, we were off again, to go and search for a cure for the Omnistra virus.